There is something about California in the 1980s that stays with people who lived through it. The neon glow, the synthesizers, the promise that anyone could make it big in the land of sunshine and opportunity. And if someone was there, they know exactly what made that decade feel like magic and heartbreak all at once. This was a time when California was the center of the world. Hollywood was producing blockbusters that defined a generation. Silicon Valley was turning garages into billion-dollar empires. The music scene was exploding with sounds that still echo today, and the beaches, the palm trees, the endless summer, it all seemed like paradise. But underneath the glamour, something was breaking. A devastating epidemic was claiming lives while the world looked away. Crack cocaine was tearing communities apart. The gap between the haves and have-nots was becoming a canyon. The California dream was real, but so was the California heartache. This was the decade that gave us the Macintosh computer, Top Gun, hair metal on the Sunset Strip, and a housing boom that would change everything. It gave us extraordinary innovation and unimaginable loss. Living in California in the 1980s meant witnessing both triumph and tragedy, sometimes on the same street corner. Let's walk through what daily life actually felt like during that unforgettable decade. Some of this might bring back memories that make you smile. Some of it might bring back memories that still hurt. Let's step into that world. Living in California in the 1980s meant embracing a lifestyle that the rest of America watched on television and wished they could have. The weather remained California's greatest gift. While the Midwest shoveled snow and the East Coast dealt with humidity, California offered sunshine that seemed endless. The indoor-outdoor lifestyle that had defined the state for decades continued, but now it had a distinctly 1980s flavor. Houses reflected the era's aesthetic. The earth tones of the 1970s gave way to brighter colors. Mauve, teal, and gray became the dominant palette. Track lighting replaced those hanging swag lamps. Glass block walls appeared in bathrooms and entryways, creating that distinctive 1980s look. Entertainment centers became massive pieces of furniture designed to hold the increasingly large televisions, the VCR, the stereo system, and eventually the home computer. The housing market was transforming California in ways that would have lasting consequences. Prices were climbing, especially in desirable coastal areas. In 1980, the median home price in California was around $100,000. By 1989, it had more than doubled. Young families who had assumed they would buy homes like their parents did were finding themselves priced out. The California dream of homeownership was becoming harder to reach. Subdivisions continued spreading into the valleys and deserts. The Inland Empire was growing as people sought affordable housing further from the coast. Orange County completed its transformation from orange groves to endless suburbs. The commute became a California institution as people moved further from their jobs to afford houses. San Francisco and Northern California maintained their distinct character. San Francisco was still the city of hills and fog, of Victorian houses and liberal politics. But the city was also becoming the epicenter of a tragedy that would define the decade. The Bay Area's tech industry was growing rapidly, drawing young professionals who pushed housing prices ever higher. The KAR culture that had always defined California evolved in the 1980s. The fuel crisis of the 1970s had made people think differently about gas mileage. Japanese imports were everywhere now. Toyotas and Hondas filled the freeways alongside American cars. But the 1980s also brought a new symbol of California's success, the German luxury car. BMWs and Mercedes became the vehicles of choice for those making it in entertainment, technology, or real estate. The freeways were becoming more congested. Traffic that had been manageable in previous decades was now a daily struggle. The Los Angeles freeway system, once a symbol of California's modernity, was becoming synonymous with gridlock. People spent hours each day in their cars, listening to KROQ or KIIS-FM, watching the palm trees pass slowly by. For teenagers, the car remained essential. Getting a driver's license at 16 meant freedom. Cruising was still a weekend activity. Whittier Boulevard in East LA, Hollywood Boulevard, Van Nuys Boulevard, these were places where young people went to see and be seen. The car you drove said everything about who you were or who you wanted to be. Before we continue with the culture and challenges that define California in this era, if you are enjoying this look back at how people really lived and want to explore more decades and places, consider subscribing. There are so many more stories about how Americans built the life we know today. The entertainment industry was at its peak in the 1980s in California. Hollywood was producing films that would become cultural touchstones. E.T. the Extraterrestrial made the world cry in 1982. Top Gun turned Tom Cruise into a megastar and made everyone want to be a fighter pilot. Back to the Future captures something about American optimism. The Breakfast Club and Ferris Bueller's Day Off defined the teenage experience. The studios were booming. Working in the industry was still the dream that drew thousands to Los Angeles each year. Waiting tables while waiting for a break was a cliche because it was true. Every restaurant in West Hollywood seemed staffed by aspiring actors. Every coffee shop had screenwriters working on their scripts. Television production remained centered in Los Angeles. The sitcoms that families watched together were filmed in studios across the city. Cheers, The Cosby Show, Family Ties, and Growing Pains shaped how Americans saw themselves. The industry employed tens of thousands directly and supported countless more jobs indirectly. The music scene in 1980s California was exploding in multiple directions simultaneously. The Sunset Strip in West Hollywood became the center of the hair metal universe. Bands like Motley Crue, Rat, Poison, and Guns N' Roses played clubs like the Whiskey A Go-Go, the Roxy, and the Troubadour. Young people with big hair and leather pants lined up hoping to get in. The scene was glamorous and excessive, fueled by substances that would claim too many lives. But California music was not just hair metal. The punk scene that had emerged in the late 1970s continued in clubs and backyards. Black Flag, the Dead Kennedys, and Social Distortion represented a rawer, angrier California. Hardcore punk shows were intense, sometimes violent, and deeply influential. Hip-hop was emerging from the streets of Los Angeles. By the late 1980s, NWA would release Straight Outta Compton and change music forever. The sound coming from South Central was telling stories that comfortable California did not want to hear. Gang violence, police brutality, and systemic inequality were laid bare in lyrics that shocked and captivated. The technology revolution that had begun in the 1970s accelerated dramatically. Silicon Valley was no longer a collection of startups and garages. It was becoming the center of a global industry. Apple released the Macintosh in 1984 with a Super Bowl commercial that promised to change everything. It did. Personal computers moved from hobbyist toys to essential tools. The video game industry centered in California was recovering from the crash of 1983 and entering a new golden age. Nintendo brought gaming back with the NES in 1985. Atari, still based in Sunnyvale, struggled, but remained part of the landscape. Arcades were everywhere, filled with teenagers pumping quarters into machines. The aerospace industry that had employed so many Californians for decades was beginning its decline. Defense contracts were still significant, but the writing was on the wall. The good union jobs that had built middle-class Southern California were starting to disappear. Communities built around these industries would face difficult transitions. What made California in the 1980s so heartbreaking was that it happened alongside so much success and innovation. The AIDS epidemic hit California, particularly San Francisco, with devastating force. By the mid-1980s, the Castro district had been transformed from a vibrant community into a place of mourning. Young men were dying by the thousands. Hospitals had entire wards dedicated to AIDS patients. Funeral homes were overwhelmed. The response from government was shamefully slow. President Reagan did not publicly address AIDS until 1985, years into the epidemic. California communities organized themselves because no one else would help. People cared for dying friends. They started organizations to provide services that government would not. They demanded research and treatment. The Names Project began in San Francisco in 1987, creating the AIDS memorial quilt that would eventually cover the National Mall in Washington. For those who lived through it, the toll was almost incomprehensible. Entire social circles were wiped out. Talented artists, writers, musicians, and ordinary people died before their time. San Francisco lost a generation. The grief shaped everything that came after. The crack cocaine epidemic hit California's inner cities with equal devastation. Beginning in the mid-1980s, crack transformed neighborhoods almost overnight. It was cheap, addictive, and destructive. South Central Los Angeles, Oakland, and other communities saw addiction, violence, and family breakdown on a massive scale. Gang violence escalated dramatically. The Bloods and Crips, which had existed since the early 1970s, became more deadly as the drug trade brought money and weapons. Young people were dying on the streets. Innocent bystanders were caught in crossfire. Parents buried children. The Los Angeles homicide rate soared. The police response often made things worse. The Los Angeles Police Department under Daryl Gates used aggressive tactics that alienated communities. Operation Hammer swept through South Central, arresting thousands. The tensions between police and minority communities that would eventually explode in 1992 were building throughout the 1980s. Homelessness became visible in California in ways it had not been before. The deinstitutionalization of mental health facilities, combined with rising housing costs and the crack epidemic, put thousands on the streets. Skid Row in Los Angeles expanded. 10 encampments appeared. The sight of people sleeping on sidewalks became common in cities that had not seen such things before. California's prosperity existed alongside desperate poverty. The economic divide was growing. The 1980s brought tremendous wealth to some Californians. Real estate developers, tech entrepreneurs, entertainment executives, and financial professionals were making fortunes. Luxury cars, designer clothes, and expensive restaurants proliferated. The wealth was conspicuous, but wages for ordinary workers were not keeping pace with rising costs. The manufacturing jobs that had provided middle-class stability were disappearing. Service jobs replaced them at lower wages. The promise that California offered opportunity for everyone was becoming harder to believe. Natural disasters reminded Californians that paradise came with risks. The Loma Prieta earthquake struck on October 17, 1989, during the World Series between two Bay Area teams. The quake registered at magnitude 6.9, and it killed 63 people and caused billions in damage. The collapse of the Cypress Street Viaduct in Oakland was broadcast to a nation watching the baseball game. The earthquake revealed how vulnerable California's infrastructure was, and how quickly everything could change. Wildfires burned through California communities. The Santa Ana winds that blow each fall drove fires through canyons and neighborhoods. People fled their homes with whatever they could carry, returning to find everything gone. The combination of development pushing into fire-prone areas and the dry California climate meant disaster was always possible. Despite everything, California in the 1980s maintained its hold on the American imagination. The beaches were still beautiful. The sunsets over the Pacific were still spectacular. The sense that anything was possible, that reinvention was always an option, remained part of California's identity. Beach culture continued to thrive. Surfing remained central to coastal identity. Volleyball on the sand became an organized sport. The casual lifestyle that had defined California for decades persisted. People still moved to California seeking sunshine and opportunity. Skateboarding evolved from 1970s backyard pools to something bigger. Tony Hawk and other professionals were making it a legitimate sport. Skate parks opened across the state. The Z-Boys' influence spread nationwide. Skateboarding was California culture exported to the world. Fitness culture exploded. Jane Fonda's workout videos made aerobics a national obsession, and California was the center of that movement. Gold's Gym in Venice Beach was where serious bodybuilders trained. Running became popular, and California's weather made year-round outdoor exercise possible. The fit, tanned California body became an ideal that people elsewhere tried to achieve. What defined California in the 1980s was contradiction. This was the state where dreams came true and dreams died, where innovation was changing the world while communities were being destroyed, where wealth accumulated while people slept on sidewalks, where the sun always shone while grief overwhelmed entire neighborhoods. The decade saw Silicon Valley cement its position as the technology capital of the world. It saw Hollywood produce films that still define popular culture. It saw California music shape what the world listened to. It saw millions of people continue to move to California seeking the life they had seen on television. But the decade also saw communities devastated by AIDS, crack, and violence. It saw housing costs begin their relentless climb. It saw the middle class squeeze that would only intensify in coming decades. It saw the gap between California's promise and California's reality grow wider. For those who lived in California during the 1980s, it was a time of extraordinary experience. The parties on the Sunset Strip, the beach days that seemed to last forever, the excitement of new technology, the movies that captured imagination, the music that became the soundtrack of youth. But it was also a time of loss. Friends who died too young, neighborhoods that changed beyond recognition, a sense that something precious was slipping away even as California seemed to be at its peak. The California of the 1980s was both everything it promised to be and a place where hearts were broken. The sunshine was real, so was the shadow. For those with memories of this complicated, beautiful, heartbreaking era in the Golden State, there is always more history to explore.